You won't believe what happened yesterday morning when I was simply waiting at the bus stop with my 10-year-old daughter. Picture this: we're standing there minding our own business, my daughter playing hopscotch on the sidewalk with her friend, when suddenly this woman comes storming over like she owns the entire neighborhood. She starts screaming at my child, not at me, but at my innocent daughter, about HOA violations and disturbing the peace. This wasn't just any random encounter. This was the kind of confrontation that makes you question how some people treat others in our community. Little did this woman know who she was dealing with. I'm Chief Martinez, the police chief of this very city, though at that moment I was just another parent in casual clothes trying to get their kid to school. What started as a typical morning routine was about to turn into a perfect example of why you should never judge a book by its cover or assume someone's position based on their appearance. The way this situation unfolded and ultimately ended will surprise you, serving as a reminder that respect and common decency should always come first, regardless of who you think you're talking to. The morning had started like any other Tuesday in our quiet suburban neighborhood. I had opted to wear my comfortable jeans and a plain gray hoodie, a stark contrast to the formal uniform I usually don during work hours. My daughter Emma, a cheerful 10-year-old with pigtails and a backpack almost as big as she was, bounced alongside me as we walked down Maple Street toward the bus stop. The early spring air was crisp, and the birds were singing their morning songs, creating what should have been a peaceful scene. Emma had met her friend Sophie at the corner, and the two girls had immediately started playing an impromptu game of hopscotch on the sidewalk, using chalk they had found to mark out the squares. Their laughter filled the air as they took turns jumping and giggling, the kind of innocent joy that makes any parent's heart warm. Other parents and children were also gathering at the bus stop, creating the familiar morning community gathering that happens in neighborhoods across America every weekday. That's when I noticed her approaching from the immaculate house at the corner, a woman in her late 40s wearing a crisp business suit and carrying a thick leather portfolio. Her perfectly styled blonde hair didn't have a strand out of place, and her designer heels clicked authoritatively against the sidewalk. I recognized her as Mrs. Henderson, the self-appointed enforcement officer of our homeowners association, though I had somehow managed to avoid any direct encounters with her until now. The way she carried herself, with her chin raised and eyes scanning the area like a hawk, should have been my first warning sign. Her expression shifted from neutral to stern as she zeroed in on the children playing hopscotch, and I watched as her pace quickened. "Excuse me," she called out sharply, her voice cutting through the morning chatter like a knife. But instead of addressing the adults present, she marched directly toward Emma and Sophie, who were mid-game and completely oblivious to the approaching storm. "You children need to stop this immediately. Do you have any idea what you're doing?" The girls froze, their chalk-covered hands still raised from their game, looking up at this imposing figure with confusion written all over their young faces. I stepped forward, intending to intercede, but Mrs. Henderson was already in full lecture mode. "This sidewalk is community property, maintained by the HOA at significant expense," she continued, her voice rising with each word. "Drawing on it with chalk is vandalism, and playing disruptive games during morning hours disturbs residents who work from home. Furthermore, your noise levels exceed the acceptable decibel limits outlined in Section 4.7 of the HOA guidelines." She jabbed her finger at the innocent hopscotch squares as if they were graffiti tags. Emma's lower lip began to tremble, and I could see confusion and fear replacing the joy that had been on her face moments earlier. Sophie had already backed away, seeking refuge near her own parent, leaving Emma to face this unexpected tirade alone. "Ma'am," I said calmly, stepping closer, "these are just children playing a harmless game while waiting for their school bus. Perhaps we could discuss any concerns more reasonably?" My attempts at diplomacy were met with a dismissive wave of her perfectly manicured hand. Mrs. Henderson turned her attention to me, and I could see her taking in my casual attire with obvious disapproval. To her, I was clearly just another negligent parent who didn't understand the importance of proper community standards. "And you must be the parent responsible for this behavior," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "Let me guess, you're probably not even aware of the HOA regulations, are you? People like you move into these neighborhoods and think you can just let your children run wild, destroying property values and disrupting the carefully maintained harmony we've worked so hard to establish. Her words stung not because they were accurate, but because of the sheer presumption behind them. I had lived in this neighborhood for 8 years, had attended HOA meetings, and had always been a responsible community member. But in her eyes, my casual attire automatically categorized me as an outsider, a troublemaker, someone beneath her notice except as a problem to be solved. The situation escalated when Mrs. Henderson pulled out her phone and began recording, announcing loudly that she was documenting violations for the HOA board and social media. Other parents began to notice the commotion, and I could see them exchanging uncomfortable glances. Some looked sympathetic, others seemed to shrink back, probably hoping to avoid becoming targets themselves. Emma was now crying softly, overwhelmed by the adult confrontation swirling around her. My protective instincts kicked into high gear, but I maintained my professional composure, hoping to de-escalate the situation without revealing my position. Mrs. Henderson, I said more firmly, I understand your concerns about HOA regulations, but there's no need to record children or make them feel bad about playing. If you have issues with the rules, perhaps we should discuss them between the adults later? This reasonable suggestion seemed to infuriate her further. She took a step closer, invading my personal space, and I could see the calculation in her eyes. In her mind, I was just another pushover parent who could be intimidated into submission. "Don't you dare tell me what I can and cannot do," she shouted, loud enough now that traffic on the street began to slow down as drivers turned to see what was happening. "I am a board member of this HOA, and I have every right to enforce our community standards. Your daughter is creating a public nuisance, and you are enabling this behavior through your negligence." She punctuated this statement by reaching out and grabbing Emma's arm, attempting to force her to stand up from where she had knelt to wipe away the chalk marks. That was the moment everything changed. The instant her hand made contact with my daughter, my professional training and parental instincts merged into a response that would completely upend this woman's world. "Ma'am," I said in a voice that carried the authority I used during official police business, "I need you to remove your hands from my daughter immediately." The change in my tone was subtle but unmistakable to anyone trained to recognize authority. Mrs. Henderson, however, was too caught up in her power trip to notice. "How dare you take that tone with me?" she shrieked, her face flushing red with anger. "Do you have any idea who I am? I know everyone in this neighborhood, including the police. I'll have you arrested for verbal assault. I'll make sure you and your little brat are banned from using this bus stop. I'll see to it that you're forced to sell your house and leave our community." Each threat was delivered with increasing volume and venom, and I could see she was working herself into a frenzy that would soon become impossible to control peacefully. It was then that she made her final mistake. In her rage, she pushed me, not hard, but forcefully enough to make me take a step back. The physical assault was the line that couldn't be uncrossed. I pulled my police chief's badge from my pocket, holding it up where she could see it clearly. "Mrs. Henderson, I am Chief Martinez of the City Police Department. You have just committed assault on a police officer and made verbal threats against citizens. I need you to calm down and step back immediately." The transformation in her demeanor was immediate and dramatic. The color drained from her face faster than water going down a drain, and her mouth opened and closed several times like a fish out of water. The hand holding her phone, which had been steady while recording her evidence, now shook visibly. But you can't be," she stammered, looking from the badge to my casual clothes and back again, as if the two couldn't possibly coexist. "Ma'am, I'm going to say this once more," I continued in my official capacity. "You need to stop recording, step away from my daughter, and remain calm while I call for a patrol unit to handle this situation properly." The other parents at the bus stop had gone silent, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of shock and fascination. Emma had stopped crying and was now looking at me with wide eyes, probably seeing her dad in cop mode for the first time in a real situation. But Mrs. Henderson, even in her shock, couldn't let go of her sense of superiority completely. "There must be some mistake," she said, her voice now trembling but still trying to maintain control. "The police chief wouldn't be dressed like. I mean, surely you understand I was just doing my duty to the community?" She was attempting damage control, but the hole was already too deep. Her words tumbled out in a desperate stream. "I was only trying to maintain property values. I'm sure if we just discuss this reasonably, we can forget this misunderstanding. I'm a respected member of this community, I serve on multiple boards, I've lived here for 15 years. The arrival of 2 patrol cars, called by my second-in-command who had been monitoring radio traffic near my location, ended her desperate monologue. 2 officers I knew well stepped out, their faces showing a mix of concern and poorly concealed amusement as they took in the scene, me in my casual clothes holding my badge, a flustered woman in a business suit looking like she'd seen a ghost, and a small crowd of neighbors watching the drama unfold. Officer Johnson approached me first, nodding respectfully. "Chief, we received a call about a disturbance at this location?" "Yes, Officer Johnson," I responded in my official capacity. "Mrs. Henderson here has committed assault on my person and made threats against my family. She was aggressive toward children, including physically grabbing my daughter without permission, and pushed me when I attempted to de-escalate the situation. The incident was recorded on her phone, which may serve as evidence." Mrs. Henderson's phone slipped from her nerveless fingers, clattering onto the sidewalk where the screen cracked in a spiderweb pattern that seemed to mirror her current situation. "Please, Chief Martinez," she begged now, all pretense of authority abandoned. "I didn't know. I would never. This is all a terrible misunderstanding. I was just trying to enforce the HOA rules, I had no idea you were law enforcement. Surely someone in your position understands the importance of community standards?" Her attempts to appeal to my sense of duty as a homeowner backfired spectacularly. "Ma'am," Officer Johnson said, stepping forward with handcuffs, "you're under arrest for assault on a police officer, making criminal threats, and disturbing the peace. You have the right to remain silent." As the Miranda rights were being read, I looked down at Emma, who was still processing this sudden turn of events. I knelt down to her level, switching back to dad mode, and gave her a reassuring hug. "Daddy," she whispered, "are you really the police chief?" The other children who had witnessed the event were now looking at me with newfound respect and awe. I nodded, smiling at her. "I am, sweetheart. And you did nothing wrong. Playing hopscotch while waiting for the bus is perfectly fine. Some adults just forget how to be kind sometimes." As Mrs. Henderson was led to the patrol car, still protesting and trying to negotiate her way out of the situation, the school bus finally arrived, its yellow bulk a welcome sight for everyone involved. The aftermath was swift and educational. Mrs. Henderson was charged and later pleaded guilty to misdemeanor assault, receiving a fine and community service that ironically included working with children at the local community center. The HOA board, embarrassed by the incident and the attention it brought to their overzealous enforcement policies, revised their regulations to be more family-friendly and respectful of reasonable public use of common areas. My identity as the police chief became an open secret in the neighborhood, leading to more respectful interactions and a noticeable decrease in petty complaints and power struggles. Emma and her friends were allowed to play hopscotch every morning at the bus stop, with other parents joining in to create impromptu games. The sidewalk chalk art became a celebrated part of our community's character rather than something to be erased and punished. Mrs. Henderson, after completing her community service, actually made a point of apologizing to Emma and Sophie personally, having learned valuable lessons about assumptions, respect, and the importance of kindness in community interactions. The incident became a teaching moment for everyone involved, about not judging people by their appearance, about the proper use of authority, about treating children with respect, and about the real purpose of community associations, to bring people together, not divide them. It also reinforced my belief that leadership isn't just about wearing a uniform, it's about how you treat people in every interaction, whether you're the police chief or just another parent at the bus stop waiting with your child. The confrontation at the bus stop had reached its climax, but the story was far from over. As Mrs. Henderson was led away in handcuffs, her perfectly composed facade completely shattered, the reality of her situation began to sink in. The other parents who had witnessed the entire exchange stood in stunned silence, watching as their neighborhood's most notorious rule enforcer was being arrested by someone they had all assumed was just another casual parent. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The woman who had spent years intimidating residents with threats of calling the police was now being arrested by the police chief himself. Officer Johnson had Mrs. Henderson secured in the back of the patrol car, where she sat rigid with shock, her earlier bravado completely evaporated. Through the window, I could see her frantically dialing on her phone with trembling hands, probably trying to reach her husband or a lawyer, but the damage was already done. Emma clung to my side, still processing what had just happened. The school bus driver, an elderly man named Mr. Peterson, approached me with a mixture of concern and relief. "Chief Martinez," he said, keeping his voice low so the children couldn't hear, "I've been watching that woman harass kids at this stop for months. Nobody ever said anything because she threatens to call the HOA board on anyone who crosses her. Thank you for finally putting an end to it." His words echoed what many of the parents were thinking but had been too afraid to voice. The fear of HOA retaliation in our community was real. Mrs. Henderson had a reputation for making life difficult for anyone who challenged her authority, using her position on multiple boards to impose fines, demand property modifications, and generally make people's lives miserable. As the patrol car with Mrs. Henderson drove away, followed by Officer Johnson's backup unit, an interesting thing happened. The tension that had been hanging over the bus stop for months, maybe years, began to dissolve. Parents who had been avoiding each other due to various HOA-related feuds started talking. Children who had been told to keep quiet and stand still began playing again, their natural energy no longer constrained by the fear of arbitrary rule enforcement. It was as if a weight had been lifted from the entire community, and people were remembering what it felt like to simply be neighbors. Sarah, the mother of Sophie, approached us with tears in her eyes. "Chief Martinez, I can't thank you enough," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "My daughter has been having nightmares about that woman. Every morning became a source of anxiety for us, wondering what new violation she would find to yell about. Last week, she made my son cry because his shoelaces weren't tied properly, claiming it violated some dress code in public spaces." Other parents nodded in agreement, sharing similar stories of harassment, intimidation, and the general atmosphere of fear that Mrs. Henderson had created over the years. The irony of the situation became even more apparent as details emerged. Mrs. Henderson, who had spent so much time berating others about following rules, had been operating under several misconceptions herself. The HOA guidelines she constantly cited included many provisions she had simply made up or wildly misinterpreted. When the actual board president, Mr. Williams, arrived after hearing about the incident, he was visibly embarrassed. "I'm so sorry, Chief Martinez," he said, shaking his head. "Mrs. Henderson has been operating way beyond her authority for years. She isn't even an enforcement officer, she's on the landscaping committee. She's been making up rules and threatening people with violations that don't even exist." This revelation sparked outrage among the gathered parents. Stories poured out about fines that had been imposed for non-existent violations, threats of legal action for minor infractions, and a general reign of terror that had made many families consider moving away from what should have been a friendly community. The HOA board president took note of each complaint, promising a complete review of their enforcement procedures and a formal apology to everyone who had been wrongfully targeted. It became clear that Mrs. Henderson had used her position to create a personal power trip, hiding behind vague references to HOA policy while actually having no authority to make most of the demands she had imposed on residents. As more patrol cars arrived to complete the documentation of the incident, I had to shift back into my professional role. Detective Reynolds, one of my most trusted officers, took over the scene, gathering statements from witnesses and collecting evidence, including the cracked phone that contained Mrs. Henderson's recording of her own misconduct. The legal implications for her were serious. Assault on a police officer, even in plainclothes, is a felony in our state, and the additional charges of threatening behavior and disturbing the peace could result in significant penalties. Meanwhile, the story spread through our quiet neighborhood like wildfire. By the time Emma and I returned home that afternoon, my phone was ringing constantly with calls from community members, local news stations, and even some national outlets who had somehow caught wind of the HOA Karen versus Police Chief story. The local newspaper editor, Jim Morrison, called personally, practically begging for an exclusive interview. "Chief, this story has everything: community drama, abuse of authority, and poetic justice. Our readers are going to love it," he said, his excitement barely contained. I declined the interview, preferring to let the facts speak for themselves rather than turning this into a media circus. The following days brought what could only be described as a community reckoning. The HOA held an emergency meeting that was attended by nearly every resident in the neighborhood, something that had never happened before. Mr. Williams, looking genuinely remorseful, announced a complete overhaul of their enforcement policies. "We allowed one person's interpretation of our rules to create an environment of fear and intimidation," he admitted. "That's not what a community association should be about. We're here to make living here better for everyone, not to police every minor action with threats and harassment." The new policies were revolutionary for our community. Children were explicitly allowed to play on sidewalks and common areas as long as they weren't causing actual damage. Chalk art was not only permitted but encouraged, with the HOA promising to organize monthly sidewalk art contests. The list of violations was reduced by more than half, focusing only on issues that genuinely affected property values or safety. Most importantly, they established an appeals process and required all enforcement officers to undergo training in community relations and conflict resolution. Mrs. Henderson's fall from grace was swift and complete. Her husband, a quiet man who had always seemed embarrassed by his wife's behavior, issued a public apology on behalf of their family. "My wife lost sight of what being part of a community means," his statement read. "She believed that enforcing rules meant intimidating people, when it should have been about helping neighbors understand and follow guidelines for everyone's benefit. Our family takes full responsibility for the pain and stress she caused, and we're committed to making this right." The legal consequences for Mrs. Henderson were significant but ultimately educational. She pleaded guilty to all charges as part of a plea agreement that included anger management counseling, community service working with children's programs, and a hefty fine. The community service was particularly fitting. She spent 6 months helping run after-school programs where she learned to interact with children positively and see them as individuals rather than rule-breaking nuisances. Teachers reported that she initially struggled with the assignment but eventually seemed to understand the value of providing safe, creative spaces for kids to play and express themselves. The transformation in our neighborhood was remarkable. Without the constant threat of arbitrary enforcement, people began to take more pride in their community. Neighbors started talking to each other again, organizing block parties and community events. Children played freely, their laughter once again filling the air at the bus stop each morning. The sidewalk chalk art became legendary, with kids creating elaborate masterpieces that parents and neighbors admired rather than criticized. Emma and Sophie, along with their friends, organized regular games and activities that brought families together rather than driving them apart. The incident also changed how I approached my dual role as police chief and community member. Other parents now saw me differently, not as an intimidating authority figure, but as someone who understood the balance between maintaining order and allowing for community life to flourish. Parents began coming to me with concerns, not about rule violations, but about how to make the neighborhood a better place for everyone. We started a neighborhood watch program that focused on helping rather than policing, and crime in our area dropped significantly as people became more engaged with their community. Mrs. Henderson's story became a cautionary tale that spread beyond our neighborhood. Local law enforcement agencies began using it as a training example of how not to handle community conflicts and the importance of understanding actual authority versus perceived authority. HOA boards in surrounding areas reviewed their own policies and enforcement procedures, with many adopting our community's new, more balanced approach. The police department received commendations for the professional handling of the situation, and several community organizations invited me to speak about the importance of community policing and mutual respect. Months later, as I stood at the same bus stop watching Emma play a spirited game of hopscotch with her friends, I reflected on how much had changed. Mrs. Henderson, having completed her community service, had moved to another state with her family, by choice, not by HOA decree. The sidewalk where the confrontation had occurred was now covered in colorful chalk art created by dozens of children over many months. Parents chatted freely, sharing coffee and conversation while keeping a loving eye on their kids. The atmosphere was everything a community should be: supportive, safe, and inclusive. Mr. Williams approached me that morning, a year after the incident, with an update. "Chief, I wanted you to know that our HOA has been recognized as one of the most improved in the county," he said proudly. "Our residents are happier, property values have actually increased because people want to live in a friendly community, and we've had 0 conflict complaints in 8 months." That incident with Mrs. Henderson was the wake-up call we needed. Emma, now known as the girl whose dad stood up to the neighborhood bully, had become something of a local legend. Other children looked up to her, and she had used her newfound status to organize inclusive games that made sure no child was left out. The confidence she had gained from seeing her father handle the situation professionally had transformed her into a natural leader among her peers. She still played hopscotch every morning, but now it was a community event rather than a furtive activity done in fear of arbitrary punishment. The final chapter came when I received a letter from Mrs. Henderson herself, forwarded through her lawyer. In it, she acknowledged the harm she had caused and thanked me for, as she put it, showing me what real authority looks like. She wrote about her experience working with children and how it had opened her eyes to the importance of nurturing rather than controlling. She had started a blog about her experience, sharing her story as a warning to others who might be tempted to abuse whatever small power they possess in community settings. The letter ended with an invitation to visit their new community, where she was working to implement the positive changes she had learned from our neighborhood's transformation. "I hope someday our paths cross again under better circumstances," she wrote. "I'd like to show you that I've learned from my mistakes and that I'm using my experience to help create communities where children can play freely and parents can feel supported rather than constantly watched for infractions." As I put the letter down, Emma looked up from her latest chalk masterpiece, a rainbow path that connected every driveway on our block. "Dad, do you think people can really change?" she asked with the wisdom of someone who had witnessed profound transformation firsthand. "I hope she's making other kids happy now, like we're happy here." Looking around at our vibrant, supportive community, the very same place that had been divided by fear and arbitrary authority just a year before, I had my answer. "Yes, sweetheart," I told her, "people can change. And sometimes it takes a community working together to help that change happen." The bus arrived, its doors opening to welcome children who no longer feared their morning gathering, and I watched as Emma and her friends boarded with smiles and waves, carrying with them the lessons of respect, courage, and the power of community that had emerged from one confrontational morning at the bus stop.